The day my son asked me to leave the house I paid for with 30 years of sacrifice, he wouldn't even look me in the eye.
Mom, I think it's best if you leave
His
now.
wife stood behind
son,
him
we need to
with her
talk.
arms
Please,
crossed,
just go.
pretending to look sad, while secretly enjoying every second of my humiliation. I remember gripping my suitcase so tightly, my fingers turned white as Ethan said, "Mom, this is what's best for everyone." What neither of them knew was that 2 days earlier, I had already changed my will. And the moment my son chose his greedy wife over me, he lost everything he thought was his. If this story already touched something in your heart, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. And before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Sometimes knowing we're all listening together makes the loneliness feel a little smaller. People see an older woman living in a beautiful waterfront home in Savannah, Georgia, and they assume her life must have been easy. They never see the years behind the polished floors and expensive chandeliers. They never see the exhaustion hidden beneath the silk blouses or the loneliness tucked behind polite smiles. My name is Daisy Marshall, and everything I owned came from sacrifice. 38 years earlier, my husband Richard and I started our furniture business in a tiny garage with 2 folding chairs, 1 second-hand desk, and a dream that felt almost foolish at the time. Richard built custom dining tables with his own hands, while I handled customers' invoices and deliveries. Some nights, we slept in that garage because we couldn't afford the gas to drive home. But we were happy. God, we were happy. Richard had this laugh that could fill an entire room. Even during the hardest years, he would kiss my forehead and say, "One day, Daisy Girl people will know the Marshall name." And eventually, they did. Marshall Home Interiors became one of the most respected luxury furniture brands in coastal Georgia. Wealthy families from Charleston, Hilton Head, and Atlanta bought our pieces. Designers featured our work in magazines. We finally had the kind of money people dream about. But life has a cruel way of collecting payment for happiness. Richard died of a heart attack at 52 years old. One minute, he was sitting at the breakfast table asking if we needed more coffee filters. The next minute, he was on the kitchen floor. I still remember Ethan screaming for the ambulance while I held Richard's hand and begged him not to leave me. My son was only 23 then. For a while, grief made the house feel haunted. Every room carried Richard's absence like smoke after a fire. But I didn't have the luxury of collapsing. I had a son to protect, so I kept working. I worked until my back ached so badly some nights I cried while taking off my shoes. I attended business meetings with migraines. I learned how to negotiate contracts Richard used to handle because I refused to let the company die with him. And through all those years, Ethan was my reason for surviving. He was a sweet boy back then, gentle, loyal, the kind of son who brought me soup when I was sick and called me every day during college just to say goodnight. Sometimes I wonder if that version of my son still exists somewhere beneath the man he became. After Richard died, Ethan tried to help at the company for a while. He wasn't naturally gifted with business the way his father had been, but he had a good heart. Customers liked him because he listened more than he talked. That mattered to me. I never needed Ethan to become rich. I only needed him to remain kind. For years, it felt like Richard and I had done something right. Then, Ethan met Rebecca Collins. I remember the first time I saw her. It was at a charity fundraiser downtown. Rebecca walked into the ballroom wearing a red satin dress that made every head turn. She was beautiful in the kind of polished, calculated way magazine women are beautiful. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect posture. She introduced herself with confidence that bordered on performance. "Mrs. Marshall, she said warmly, touching my arm. "I've heard so much about you. Ethan talks about you constantly." At first I liked her. Honestly, I did. She was charming in public. She laughed at my stories. She offered to carry my purse. She sent me flowers after our second meeting. But there was something about the way her eyes moved through my home the first time she visited. Most people admire a house naturally. Rebecca studied it. Her gaze lingered on artwork antiques, silver frames, and expensive marble countertops with a strange intensity, like she was mentally calculating value. At dinner that evening, she asked questions that felt oddly specific. "How much is waterfront property worth around here these days? When did you buy this house? Do you own the business building too?" Ethan laughed and told her she sounded like a real estate agent. Rebecca smiled sweetly and squeezed his hand beneath the table. "I'm just curious," she said. But I remember a small, cold feeling settling in my stomach. Women my age learn to trust those instincts. Unfortunately, mothers also learn how easy it is to ignore them when their child looks happy. Ethan fell in love fast, too fast. Within a year, they were engaged. I paid for the wedding myself because Ethan insisted money was tight. Rebecca wanted a luxury ceremony at the historic Davenport House Garden in Savannah, with crystal chandeliers, imported roses, and a live jazz quartet. The wedding cost more than my first house. But Ethan looked happy, and after losing Richard, I had promised myself I would never become the kind of bitter mother-in-law who poisoned her son's marriage. So I smiled through everything. I smiled when Rebecca rejected the pearl earrings Richard bought me decades earlier because they weren't modern enough. I smiled when she changed family holiday traditions after the wedding. I smiled when Ethan started missing Sunday dinners because Rebecca had other plans. Little by little, my son drifted away from me. Not suddenly. That's the dangerous part. Manipulation rarely arrives screaming. It arrives quietly. A canceled lunch here, a forgotten phone call there, a wife whispering opinions late at night while her husband lies half asleep beside her. And slowly, the child you raised begins looking at you through someone else's eyes. About 6 months into their marriage, Ethan stopped asking for my advice about the company. A year later, he stopped dropping by unexpectedly. Then one afternoon, I overheard Rebecca say something that stayed with me long after she left the room. We were standing in my kitchen while Ethan answered a phone call outside. Rebecca looked around the house and smiled faintly. "You know," she said casually, "this place is probably worth millions now." I laughed politely. "I suppose it is." She traced one manicured finger along the marble counter. "It'll all belong to Ethan someday anyway." Something about the certainty in her voice unsettled me. Not because of greed alone, but because she spoke as if my existence was already temporary. As if I were simply an obstacle standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. That night after they left, I sat alone in my enormous dining room, staring at the empty chairs around me. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like something people were waiting to inherit. And deep down, though I hated admitting it, I realized something terrifying. Rebecca Collins didn't marry my son because she loved the Marshall family. She married him because she wanted what carried our name. At first, Rebecca's control over Ethan was subtle enough to make me question my own instincts. That's how manipulation works when it's done by someone intelligent. If she had been openly cruel from the beginning, Ethan would have noticed. Maybe even I would have fought harder sooner. But Rebecca understood something dangerous about human nature. People accept poison more easily when it's mixed with affection. The first changes seemed harmless. Ethan started canceling our weekly breakfasts because Rebecca had planned brunch with friends. Then he stopped answering my evening calls. Then holidays became complicated. Rebecca always had a reason. Her parents wanted Christmas Eve. A couple's trip had already been booked. They needed private time as newlyweds. Every excuse sounded reasonable by itself, but loneliness builds quietly, like water rising around your ankles before you realize you're drowning. One afternoon, Ethan came by the showroom downtown while I was reviewing fabric samples with my design team. He looked distracted, exhausted somehow. Rebecca had that effect on him lately. He hugged me quickly and glanced around the office. "You still doing all this yourself?" he asked. I laughed softly. "Someone has to keep this company running. You should slow down, Mom." There was something rehearsed about the sentence. I looked up from the samples. "What does that mean?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "I just think you deserve to enjoy life now. Travel more, relax." I smiled faintly. "I enjoy working, Ethan. Your father built this company with me. I know." But his tone sounded impatient. That hurt more than I expected. Before Rebecca came into his life, Ethan used to love hearing stories about Richard and the early business days. Now every mention of the company seemed to annoy him. That evening, Rebecca arrived at my house carrying an expensive bottle of wine and one of those bright smiles she wore when she wanted something. "Girls' night," she announced cheerfully. I almost laughed at the phrase. At 68 years old, I certainly wasn't part of any girls' night anymore. Still, I welcomed her in. We sat on the back patio overlooking the river, while the sunset painted the water gold. Rebecca complimented my garden, my jewelry, my furniture. Too many compliments. People who genuinely admire something don't usually work that hard to prove it. Then finally, she arrived at the real conversation. "You know," she said casually, swirling wine in her glass, "Ethan worries about you." I raised an eyebrow. "He does. He thinks you work too much." She tilted her head sympathetically. "Honestly, Daisy, you've accomplished so much already. Most women your age would have retired years ago." "I'm not most women." She laughed lightly. "No, you definitely aren't." There was a pause. Then she said the sentence that changed something inside me. "Have you ever thought about transferring the company to Ethan now instead of waiting?" I stared at her quietly. Rebecca kept smiling. "It would reduce stress for you," she continued. "And Ethan has such great ideas for modernizing the business." Modernizing. That word again. Rebecca loved using it whenever she wanted to insult something older. I took a slow sip of wine. "The company is already partially Ethan's in my will." "Yes, but wills can be messy," she replied quickly. "What if something unexpected happened?" There it was. Not concern, calculation. I looked directly into her eyes for the first time that evening and saw something cold hiding beneath the charm. Fear flickered through me. Not fear of losing money. Fear of realizing someone close to my son viewed my death as a financial event. I set my glass down carefully. "I'm perfectly healthy, Rebecca." "Of course," she said immediately. "I didn't mean I know exactly what you meant." For a split second her smile disappeared, and in that brief moment I finally saw the real woman beneath the polished exterior. Hard, impatient, hungry. But just as quickly the mask returned. "You're misunderstanding me," she said softly. "I only want what's best for this family." Funny how dangerous people always describe themselves that way. After she left, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house, remembering all the nights Ethan used to sit at the kitchen counter doing homework while I prepared dinner. He used to tell me everything. Now conversations with my son felt guarded, filtered. Like Rebecca stood invisibly between us, even when she wasn't physically present. Over the following months, the changes became impossible to ignore. Ethan stopped consulting me about business decisions entirely. Sometimes I learned important company updates from employees before hearing them from my own son. Rebecca also became strangely interested in my finances. she'd ask questions during dinner that made my stomach tighten. How much are the company shares worth now? Have you updated your estate plan recently? Do you still own the Hilton Head property? One night, she even asked where I kept important legal documents. She disguised everything as casual curiosity. But mothers survive long enough to recognize greed when it sits across the dinner table smiling politely. The worst part wasn't Rebecca. It was watching Ethan slowly become someone I no longer recognized. One Sunday afternoon, he came over while I was organizing old photographs. I showed him a picture of Richard holding him as a little boy at Tybee Island Beach. Normally, Ethan loved those memories. But this time, he barely glanced at the photo. "Mom," he said carefully, "Rebecca thinks you should hire someone to help manage your finances." I felt my chest tighten. I already have accountants. She means more personally. I stared at him. "Why?" He sighed heavily like I was being difficult. "Because you're not getting younger. There are sentences children say that mothers never forget. That was one of them. Not getting younger. As if aging suddenly made me incapable of thinking. As if my decades of building a business meant nothing now that my hair had turned gray. I closed the photo album slowly. "Do you think I can't manage my own life anymore?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "That's not what I'm saying, but it is what Rebecca's saying." He looked frustrated. "Why do you always assume the worst about her?" "Because I see her clearly." I wanted to scream. "Because she looks at my life like it's already hers." Instead, I swallowed the pain and asked quietly, "Do you trust your mother?" "Of course I do." But he hesitated before answering. That hesitation shattered something inside me. Rebecca had done what I once thought impossible. She had planted doubt inside my own son. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, listening to rain hit the windows, while a terrible realization settled over me. Rebecca wasn't simply trying to become part of the Marshall family. She was trying to replace me inside it, and worst of all, Ethan was letting her. The dinner that finally broke my heart happened on a warm Friday evening in late September. I remember because the magnolia trees outside my dining room windows were beginning to lose their leaves, and Richard always loved that time of year. Back when he was alive, family dinners used to mean laughter. Now they felt like carefully staged performances where everyone pretended not to notice the tension sitting at the table. I spent the entire afternoon cooking Ethan's favorite meal: pot roast with rosemary, homemade mashed potatoes, fresh peach cobbler, the same meal I used to make after his little league games when he was a boy. Part of me still believed food could fix things. That maybe if I recreated enough happy memories, I could somehow bring my son back to me. I should have known better. Rebecca arrived nearly 40 minutes late, wearing a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ethan followed behind her, carrying 2 bottles of wine and looking distracted, already exhausted before dinner had even started. Rebecca kissed the air beside my cheek. "Sorry we're late," she said. Traffic downtown was insane. "It's fine," I answered quietly. But it wasn't fine. Nothing between us was fine anymore. Dinner started politely enough. Rebecca complimented the candles. Ethan asked about business inventory. I talked about a charity fundraiser the company was sponsoring. All of us performing normalcy. Then Rebecca's eyes landed on the antique china cabinet near the dining room wall. Richard bought that cabinet during our 10th anniversary trip to Charleston. It was one of the few possessions in my home I truly treasured. Rebecca tilted her head. "You still keep all this old furniture?" she asked casually. I smiled faintly. "Some of it has sentimental value." "I guess vintage is becoming trendy again," she replied. "Vintage?" The word stung more than it should have. I noticed Ethan avoiding eye contact. Rebecca continued eating before speaking again. Honestly, though, Daisy, this house could look incredible with a full renovation. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. This house is fine the way it is. Oh, I don't mean bad, she said quickly. It just feels a little outdated. Outdated. Another favorite word of hers. She used it for furniture, traditions, values, and increasingly for me. Ethan cleared his throat softly. Rebecca's been looking at some modern interior ideas. Of course she had. Because apparently my home now required her approval too. I tried to keep my voice calm. Your father designed most of this house himself. Rebecca smiled politely. And he had beautiful taste for his generation. For his generation. God. There's a particular kind of insult wealthy, polished people use, where every word sounds gracious while quietly cutting you open. Rebecca had mastered it. I set my napkin down slowly. You seem very interested in changing things around here. She laughed lightly. I just think homes should evolve with the people living in them. The people living in them. Not me. Them. I finally understood. In Rebecca's mind, my house already belonged to her and Ethan. I was simply occupying it temporarily. The realization made my stomach twist. Ethan reached for his wine glass. Mom, he said carefully. You have to admit the house does feel a little big for one person. There it was, the first real crack. I looked at my son across the candlelit table and barely recognized him. This house has been my home for 30 years. I know, he replied. We're just saying maybe it's time to simplify your life. Rebecca nodded sympathetically. Exactly. Less stress, less responsibility, less existence. That's what they really meant. The room suddenly felt too warm. I stood to refill my water glass, mostly because I needed an excuse to breathe. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard Rebecca's voice behind me. She's emotionally attached to things. That's normal at her age. At her age. Not my name. Not Daisy. Just another aging woman becoming inconvenient. I stopped in the doorway, my back still turned toward them. Ethan lowered his voice, but not enough. Just don't push too hard tonight. Rebecca sighed dramatically. I'm trying to help her. I stayed perfectly still for a moment, gripping the kitchen counter so hard my fingers hurt. Then I composed myself and returned to the table with a smile I didn't feel. The rest of dinner became unbearable. Rebecca shifted the conversation toward finances. Again. So how is the company doing this quarter? She asked casually. Fine. Still profitable even with the market slowing down? Yes. She exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. That glance didn't belong to a loving couple making conversation. It belonged to business partners evaluating an asset. Then Rebecca said the sentence that changed everything. You know, Daisy, eventually Ethan will have to take over all of this anyway. Silence filled the dining room. I stared at her. She continued smiling. The business, the properties, the investments, that's a huge burden for one person to manage later on. My chest tightened. I've managed it perfectly well so far. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. But wouldn't it make more sense to transition things now while you're still healthy enough to help? There it was. Finally, no more pretending. Ethan rubbed his forehead nervously. Rebecca? No, I'm serious, she continued. You work too much, Daisy. You're nearly 70. The way she said nearly 70 made me feel ancient, fragile, disposable. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me. Waiting for him to remind his wife that I built everything they were discussing. Waiting for him to say, that's enough. Instead, Ethan sighed heavily. She does have a point, Mom. The world inside me went quiet. I cannot fully describe the pain of hearing your child side against you. while someone else tears you apart, especially after you spent your entire life protecting them. I looked at Ethan carefully. So you agree with her? He avoided my eyes. I just think maybe it's time to start thinking realistically. Realistically. Such a harmless word, yet somehow it felt like betrayal. Rebecca softened her voice as if speaking to a stubborn child. No one's trying to hurt you, but they already had. Deeply. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. I think dinner is over. Ethan looked startled. Mom? No, I interrupted quietly. I'm tired. Rebecca crossed her arms. We were only having an honest conversation. I looked directly at her then. For the first time in months, I stopped trying to keep peace. And you seem awfully comfortable discussing my life as if I'm already gone. Her expression hardened instantly. Just for a second. But I saw it. The real Rebecca. Cold, calculating, impatient. Ethan stood up quickly. Mom, Rebecca didn't mean it like that. I laughed softly, though my eyes burned with tears. That's the problem, Ethan, I whispered. I think she meant exactly that. He looked angry then, actually angry at me. Why do you always assume the worst about her? The question hit harder than any insult Rebecca had ever thrown at me, because suddenly I understood something devastating. My son no longer saw me as the person who raised him. He saw me as an obstacle to his marriage, and Rebecca knew it. As they gathered their things to leave, she paused near the front door and looked back at my home one more time. Not with admiration, with ownership. That night, after the silence settled back into the house, I sat alone at the dining table staring at Richard's empty chair. And for the first time in my life, I felt unwelcome inside my own family. 3 weeks after that disastrous dinner, Ethan arrived at my house carrying a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. The moment I saw it, something inside me tightened. People don't bring folders to family visits unless they intend to change something permanently. I opened the front door slowly. Hi, sweetheart. Ethan kissed my cheek distractedly and stepped inside. You busy? I was reading. He glanced toward the living room, but didn't sit down. That nervous energy again. Rebecca's influence always clung to him like expensive cologne. Can we talk? He asked. I already knew I wasn't going to like the conversation. We sat at the kitchen table where I used to help him with math homework as a child. Funny how life circles back to the same places for completely different reasons. Ethan placed the leather folder carefully between us. Rebecca and I have been worried about you. There it was again, that rehearsed sentence. I folded my hands calmly. About what exactly? He hesitated. You've been overwhelmed lately. I have. You seem tired all the time. I almost laughed. I'd spent 40 years building a business from nothing. Tiredness wasn't exactly a new condition for me. Then Ethan opened the folder and slid several papers across the table. Legal documents. My stomach dropped instantly. What is this? It's just a precaution, he said quickly. Temporary financial power of attorney stuff. Nothing extreme. I stared at him. Excuse me, Mom, please don't get upset. Too late. The room suddenly felt smaller. I picked up the papers with trembling fingers. The documents would give Ethan control over my financial decisions if I became unable to manage my affairs independently. Unable. Such a dangerous word. Rebecca thinks I don't care what Rebecca thinks. The sharpness in my voice startled even me. Ethan leaned back, frustrated already. She's trying to help. No, I said quietly. She's trying to prepare for my death. That's ridiculous. Is it? He rubbed his forehead. Mom, why are you making her the enemy? I looked down at the paperwork again. There it was in black ink. Control, access, authority. Everything Rebecca had been slowly circling around for months. And somehow my own son couldn't see it. Or worse, maybe he could. I placed the papers back on the table carefully. I'm not signing this. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. You didn't even read everything. I read enough. You're being stubborn. That word cut deep. Stubborn. As if protecting my own life's work were childish behavior. I stood slowly and walked toward the sink, just to put distance between us. When your father died, I said quietly, I worked 16-hour days to keep this company alive. Ethan sighed heavily behind me. I know. No, I whispered. You don't. I turned around. You know what Rebecca sees when she looks at me, a bank account with wrinkles? Stop talking about her like that. The anger in his voice shocked me. Not because he defended his wife, but because he defended her with more passion than he had defended me in months. I'm your mother, Ethan, and she's my wife. The silence after those words felt unbearable. There are moments when relationships shift permanently. Tiny invisible fractures that never fully heal afterward. That was one of them. I swallowed hard. So that's it. No one's attacking you. You came into my home with legal paperwork because we care about you. I stared at him. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding for months. Whose idea was this really? Ethan looked away. That was answer enough. After he left that afternoon, I sat alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the unsigned papers. I kept hearing Richard's voice in my head. Protect what we built, Daisy girl. Back then, I thought he meant the company. Now I realized he also meant my dignity. Over the next few days, things became stranger. My longtime housekeeper, Maria, suddenly quit. After 22 years, no warning, no goodbye, just a short phone call filled with uncomfortable pauses. I'm sorry, Mrs. Marshall, she whispered. I can't work there anymore. I knew immediately someone had pressured her. 2 days later, my gardener stopped showing up too. Then my bridge club friend Eleanor called, sounding nervous. Rebecca mentioned you've been having memory issues, she said carefully. I just wanted to check on you. I nearly dropped the phone. Memory issues. Rebecca was laying groundwork, slowly, strategically, poisoning people's perception of me before making a larger move. That realization terrified me more than I wanted to admit. And then Olivia Carter walked into my life. She arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning carrying a canvas tote bag and wearing a denim jacket that looked slightly too thin for the weather. Rebecca introduced her casually. This is Olivia. She'll be helping around the house a few days a week. I frowned immediately. I never asked for help. Rebecca smiled brightly. It's just temporary support. Ethan thought it would make things easier. Of course he did. Olivia looked uncomfortable standing there between us. She couldn't have been older than 26. Soft brown hair pulled into a ponytail. Nervous eyes. No designer labels. No polished socialite smile. Just ordinary and strangely sincere. It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Marshall, she said softly. Please, I replied. Call me Daisy. Rebecca checked her watch dramatically. Well, I have lunch downtown, so I should go. Olivia can organize medications, meals, errands. Organize medications. The phrase lingered in my mind, unpleasantly. The second Rebecca left, silence filled the room. Olivia shifted awkwardly. I'm sorry if this feels weird, she admitted quietly. I honestly thought you knew I was coming. I studied her face carefully. No manipulation. No fake sweetness, just honesty. That makes two of us, I said. To my surprise, Olivia laughed softly. And somehow, That simple laugh felt more genuine than anything Rebecca had said to me in over a year. Over the next week, Olivia helped around the house, while Rebecca became increasingly controlling from a distance. Suddenly, my pharmacy deliveries were being redirected. Rebecca insisted on handling my doctor appointments. She even started calling daily to check in. Every conversation carried the same underlying message. You're fragile now. You need supervision. One afternoon, Olivia found me struggling to open a stubborn jar in the kitchen. Before I could laugh at myself, Rebecca walked in unexpectedly. Her eyes immediately sharpened. "Oh my God," she said dramatically. "See, this is exactly what Ethan and I are worried about." I stared at her in disbelief. "It's a pickle jar, Rebecca." But she was already watching me with clinical observation instead of compassion. Like she was collecting evidence. That night, while Olivia helped dry dishes, she hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She lowered her voice. "Has Rebecca always treated you like this?" I looked at her carefully. "You noticed it too." Olivia nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, I realized something important. I wasn't imagining any of this. Rebecca wasn't simply concerned about my well-being. She was isolating me, one person at a time, and somehow, terrifyingly, my son was helping her do it. The first time I realized Rebecca was deliberately trying to make me look mentally unstable, I almost convinced myself I was overreacting, because the alternative was too horrifying to accept. It started with little things: missing medication, forgotten appointments, objects moved from their usual places. At first, I blamed myself. Aging makes you question your own memory in cruel ways. You walk into rooms and forget why you entered. You misplace reading glasses while they're sitting on your head. So when my blood pressure pills disappeared one morning, I assumed I had simply misplaced them. Rebecca arrived at the house an hour later, carrying coffee and fake concern. "Did you take your medication today?" she asked casually. "I can't find it." Her expression tightened immediately. "That's not good, Daisy." Not worried. Satisfied. I see that clearly now. At the time, though, I only felt embarrassed. Olivia helped me search the kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom, while Rebecca kept sighing dramatically behind us. "This is exactly what Ethan and I have been talking about," she murmured. I hated the way she said Ethan and I now, like they had become a separate team, a united front against me. Eventually, Olivia found the medication bottle inside the laundry room cabinet behind cleaning supplies. An impossible place. I never stored medication there. Rebecca pressed her lips together tightly. "Well," she said slowly, "at least we found it." But I caught the tiny flicker in her eyes. Disappointment. That was the first moment something icy moved through my chest. 2 days later, it happened again. I woke in the middle of the night, smelling gas. Panic shot through me instantly. I rushed downstairs and found one burner on the stove barely turned open, without a flame. My hands shook as I turned it off. By morning, Rebecca already knew. Of course she did. She arrived before breakfast with Ethan trailing behind her, looking pale and stressed. "Mom," he said immediately Rebecca told me what happened. I stared at her. "You told him she was scared for you," Ethan said. I looked directly at Rebecca. "I know I turned that stove off last night." Her eyebrows lifted sympathetically. "That's what makes this concerning." Concerning. Everything with her became a diagnosis, an evaluation, a slow construction of evidence against me. "I'm not losing my mind," I snapped. Ethan exhaled heavily. "No one said you were," but both of them were thinking it. I could see it all over their faces. Later that afternoon, Olivia quietly approached me while folding towels in the laundry room. Can I tell you something without upsetting you? I looked up immediately. What is it? She hesitated. This morning, before you woke up, I saw Rebecca in the kitchen. A strange chill spread through me, doing what Olivia swallowed hard. She turned the stove knob. The towel slipped from my hands. For a second, I genuinely couldn't breathe. You're sure she didn't know I saw her? My knees weakened so badly I had to sit down, because suddenly every strange incident rearranged itself into something terrifyingly logical. The missing medication, the misplaced keys, the confusion. Rebecca was creating it, deliberately. I pressed trembling fingers against my forehead. My God! Olivia sat beside me carefully. I didn't want to accuse anyone unfairly, she whispered. But something feels wrong here. Wrong. That word barely covered it. My own daughter-in-law was manufacturing evidence to make me appear mentally incompetent. And somehow my son was too blinded by love or manipulation to notice. That realization broke something deep inside me. For the next several days, I started paying attention more carefully. Really paying attention. And once I did, Rebecca's behavior became impossible to ignore. She'd move my reading glasses and later find them. She'd interrupt conversations when I spoke to Ethan privately. She constantly used phrases like, "You already told me that. You must have forgotten. That's not what happened." Little psychological cuts designed to make me doubt myself. The worst part? Sometimes it worked. One evening, I stood in my bedroom crying because I genuinely couldn't remember whether I had locked the front door earlier. That's what manipulation does over time. It colonizes your confidence. But Rebecca made one mistake. She underestimated Olivia. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Rebecca arrived unexpectedly while Ethan was at work. I was upstairs resting when Olivia overheard Rebecca speaking on the phone in the kitchen. Olivia later repeated every word to me. "She's getting worse," Rebecca whispered into the phone. Honestly, I think it's only a matter of time before Ethan agrees she can't live alone anymore. Olivia said there was a pause before Rebecca laughed softly. No, she still hasn't signed anything yet, but she will. When Olivia told me that rage flooded through me so suddenly, I thought I might be sick. Not grief, not sadness. Rage. Because this woman wasn't simply trying to take my money anymore. She was trying to erase my independence, my dignity, my identity, and she was using my own son to do it. That night, I pulled out an old wooden box Richard once kept hidden in his office. Inside were important documents, spare keys, emergency cash, and a small digital recorder Richard used years ago during business negotiations. I stared at the recorder for a long time. Then I charged it. If Rebecca wanted to build a case against me, I would start building one against her. The following morning, I placed the recorder inside my cardigan pocket before breakfast. Rebecca arrived around 10 carrying pastries and fake sweetness. "Good morning, Daisy," she sang brightly. I forced myself to smile. "Morning." She wandered around the kitchen while I made coffee. Then casually she moved my purse from the counter to a dining room chair while pretending to check her phone. Tiny things. Always tiny things. But now I was watching, listening, documenting. That afternoon, she intentionally handed me the wrong doctor appointment time and later acted concerned when I seemed confused. "Oh, Daisy," she sighed dramatically. "I'm starting to worry." Meanwhile, Ethan grew increasingly distant. He called me less, questioned me more. Once, when I became frustrated during an argument, he actually said, "Mom, maybe you don't remember things as clearly as you think." That sentence hurt more than anything Rebecca had done directly, because it meant the manipulation was working. Some nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had already lost my son forever. But then, I'd remember Olivia's face when she warned me. the sincerity, the concern, and I realized something important. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't confused. I was being hunted inside my own home. Late one evening, Olivia knocked softly on my bedroom door, holding her phone. "You need to hear this," she whispered. She pressed play on a recording she had secretly captured downstairs. Rebecca's voice filled the room. If Ethan would stop feeling guilty, this would all be easier. "She's old. Eventually, she'll either sign everything over or end up in assisted living anyway." I felt the blood drain from my face. Then Rebecca laughed quietly. And in that moment, listening to that cold, ugly sound, I finally understood something horrifying. Rebecca wasn't waiting for me to die naturally. She was preparing to remove me from my own life long before that happened. The day my son asked me to leave my own home, the sky over Savannah was painfully beautiful. Bright blue, warm sunlight, the kind of peaceful afternoon that makes betrayal feel even crueler somehow. I had spent the morning trimming roses in the backyard garden Richard planted for me 20 years earlier. My knees hurt afterward, but the work calmed my mind. Lately, gardening was the only thing that still did. Olivia was inside making tea when Ethan's car pulled into the driveway. The second I saw Rebecca sitting in the passenger seat, my stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Ethan entered first, avoiding eye contact almost immediately. Rebecca followed behind him, carrying that same expression she always wore when pretending to be compassionate. Olivia glanced at me nervously from the kitchen doorway. She sensed it too. "Can we sit down?" Ethan asked quietly. There are sentences that arrive carrying disaster inside them. That was one of them. We gathered in the living room where Richard's old piano still sat untouched near the windows. Ethan remained standing while Rebecca perched delicately on the sofa beside him like a supportive attorney preparing for court. I suddenly understood this conversation had already been rehearsed between them beforehand. Every word, every expression, every pause. Ethan rubbed his hands together anxiously. "Mom, things have gotten really stressful lately." I stared at him silently. Rebecca spoke first. "We're worried about your health." There it was again, that phrase, like a knife she kept sharpening. "My health is fine," I answered coldly. Rebecca sighed softly. "The stove incident. You caused the stove incident." Her eyes widened instantly. "Excuse me, you heard me?" Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Mom, stop." "No," I snapped. "I'm tired of being treated like I'm crazy." Rebecca looked wounded now, an Oscar-worthy performance. "I've done nothing except try to help you." Olivia shifted uncomfortably nearby, but stayed silent. Smart girl. She understood this situation had become dangerous. Ethan exhaled heavily. "This fighting can't continue." I looked at my son carefully. The exhaustion in his face wasn't just stress anymore. It was surrender. Rebecca had worn him down until agreeing with her became easier than questioning her. Then he said the words that shattered me. "Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while." The room went completely silent. I actually thought I had misunderstood him at first. "What, just temporarily?" he said quickly. "Until things calm down." I stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to leave my own house?" Rebecca leaned forward sympathetically. "No one's forcing you out, Daisy." I laughed softly. The sound didn't even feel human. "Then what exactly are you doing?" Ethan looked miserable. "Rebecca's under a lot of stress." That sentence. God, after everything I had sacrificed for him, that was his explanation. Not my pain, not my humiliation, Rebecca's stress. I looked around the living room slowly. Richard's piano, my wedding photographs, the antique clock we bought during our honeymoon. Every inch of that house carried pieces of my life, and now my own child was asking me to leave it because his wife felt uncomfortable. My chest hurt so badly I struggled to breathe normally. "I paid for this house," I whispered. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I know." "No," I said louder. "You clearly don't." Rebecca crossed one leg elegantly. "Daisy, maybe an assisted living community would actually be healthier for you socially." That sentence hit me like ice water. Assisted living. There it was. The real destination they had been quietly guiding me toward all along. Not concern, removal. I turned toward Ethan desperately. "You're really letting her do this?" His face tightened immediately. "She's my wife, and I'm your mother." He looked away. That tiny movement broke something inside me permanently, because suddenly I understood the truth. I had already lost him. Not legally, not physically, but emotionally. Rebecca had taken my son, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left of the boy I raised. Olivia finally stepped forward carefully. "Mrs. Marshall isn't confused," she said quietly. Rebecca's eyes flashed instantly. "This is family business, Olivia." "No," Olivia replied softly but firmly. "This is wrong." I saw genuine panic flicker across Rebecca's face for the first time, because manipulation survives in silence. And Olivia had just interrupted it. Ethan looked uncomfortable. "Olivia, please stay out of this." She lowered her eyes immediately, but I silently thanked God for her courage. I stood slowly. My legs felt strangely weak. "If my presence is such a burden," I said quietly, "then I'll leave." Ethan's expression shifted briefly with guilt, but Rebecca looked relieved. Actually relieved. That hurt more than anything else. I walked upstairs without another word, while my son remained downstairs beside the woman who had helped destroy our family. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door and finally let myself cry. Not loud, dramatic sobbing, just silent tears sliding down my face while I stared at the closet Richard built with his own hands. I remembered Ethan as a little boy running into this room during thunderstorms because he was scared. I remembered staying awake beside his hospital bed when he got pneumonia at age 7. I remembered working double shifts so he could attend college debt-free. And somehow, I still ended up alone. There's a particular grief mothers rarely talk about. The grief of realizing your child no longer sees your sacrifices as love, only obligation. I packed quietly, one suitcase, a few clothes, family photographs, Richard's watch. And then I opened the hidden wooden box from the back of my closet. Inside were copies of property deeds, investment records, business documents, insurance papers, and my original will. The real heart of everything Rebecca wanted. I held the folder against my chest for a long moment. Then I placed it carefully into my suitcase. Downstairs, the house felt painfully tense. Rebecca pretended to scroll through her phone while Ethan paced near the fireplace. Olivia stood near the kitchen, looking furious on my behalf. I descended the staircase, slowly carrying my suitcase. The second Ethan saw it, his face crumpled slightly. "Mom," but he still didn't stop me. That's the part I'll never forget. Not once did my son say stay. Rebecca rose quickly. "We can help you find somewhere comfortable." Comfortable? As if exile could be softened with nice furniture. I looked directly at her. "You should be very careful what you celebrate, Rebecca." For the first time, her smile faltered completely. Then I turned toward Ethan. He looked like a man watching his own house burn while convincing himself the fire was necessary. "I hope someday," I whispered, "you understand what this moment cost." Tears filled his eyes. But still, he said nothing. Olivia rushed forward, and grabbed my suitcase before I could carry it myself. "I'm coming with you," she said quietly. Rebecca immediately objected. "That's inappropriate." Olivia ignored her completely. I think that was the moment I truly began loving that girl. Not because she defended me, but because she stayed when my own family didn't. As we stepped outside, warm wind moved through the magnolia trees lining the driveway. I paused at the front door one final time. That house held almost 40 years of my life. My marriage, my motherhood, my memories, and now it belonged to silence. But before leaving, I looked back at Ethan one last time. And while Rebecca believed she had finally won, neither of them realized something critical. I still controlled every dollar they were counting on inheriting. And hidden inside my suitcase was the power to change both their futures forever. The cottage smelled like salt air, old wood, and forgotten summers. Richard bought it for me 25 years earlier after our first truly successful year in business. It sat quietly along the Georgia coastline, about an hour outside Savannah, hidden behind seagrass and twisted oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Back then, we used to escape there whenever life became too loud. After Richard died, I stopped visiting. Some places hurt too much when the people you loved are no longer inside them. But now, strangely, that little cottage became the only place left that still felt safe. Olivia drove us there the evening Ethan asked me to leave my own home. The entire ride passed mostly in silence, except for soft music playing through the car speakers and the occasional sound of Olivia quietly wiping away angry tears she thought I didn't notice. I didn't mention them. I was too busy trying not to fall apart myself. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting over the water in streaks of orange and gold. The cottage looked smaller than I remembered. Older, too. Weathered white paint, a wraparound porch, blue shutters. Richard installed himself one summer, while Ethan chased crabs barefoot on the beach nearby. For a moment, standing there with my suitcase in hand, grief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. Because this little house held ghosts of happier versions of us. Olivia gently touched my arm. "It's beautiful," she whispered. I swallowed hard. It used to be. But later that night, after we cleaned dust from the furniture and opened the windows to let ocean air inside, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, I could breathe. No tension. No Rebecca watching me. No carefully staged concern. No feeling like I was slowly disappearing inside my own home. Just silence. Peaceful silence. Olivia insisted on making dinner despite the nearly empty kitchen. Somehow she managed to turn canned soup and stale crackers into something comforting, simply by the way she served it. That girl had kindness woven into her naturally, a rare thing these days. After dinner, we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, listening to waves crash softly in the distance. Olivia glanced toward me carefully. "You don't have to talk tonight if you don't want to." I stared out toward the dark ocean. "Thank you." Another silence settled between us. Then, unexpectedly, I heard myself ask, "Did your family ever betray you?" Olivia looked down immediately. The sadness in her face answered before her words did. "I don't really have one." I turned toward her slowly. She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I grew up in foster care." Something inside me tightened painfully. How long? My whole childhood. The wind moved softly through her hair while she spoke. "My mom struggled with addiction. I never knew my dad." She shrugged gently. "After a while, you stop expecting people to stay." God. That sentence shattered me. Because suddenly, I understood why Olivia's kindness felt different from Rebecca's polished performance. Olivia knew what abandonment actually felt like. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She smiled faintly. It's okay. Some foster homes were good. Some weren't. Her eyes drifted toward the ocean. You learn how to survive. Survive. I knew something about that too. For the next few days, a strange rhythm formed between us. Peaceful mornings, coffee on the porch, walks along the shoreline. Olivia helped me organize the cottage while I slowly began untangling myself emotionally from the life I had left behind. But healing is complicated when betrayal still lives inside your chest. Some mornings, I woke up furious at Ethan. Other mornings, I missed him so badly it physically hurt. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Even after your child breaks your heart, part of you still searches for excuses to protect them. One afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs storage room, Olivia discovered old photo albums stacked inside a cedar trunk. We spent hours flipping through them together. There was Richard holding baby Ethan, me laughing beside bonfires on the beach. Family Christmas mornings, birthday parties, a whole life frozen inside photographs. Olivia studied one picture carefully. "You looked really happy," she said softly. We were, and we truly had been. That's what made the loss unbearable. Not just losing my son emotionally, but losing the family we once were. Later that evening, while organizing papers from my suitcase, Olivia noticed the folder containing my legal documents. Her expression shifted slightly. "You brought all your financial records," I nodded. I didn't trust leaving them behind. She hesitated carefully before speaking again. "Do you think Rebecca was trying to take control of everything?" I laughed bitterly. She already was. Then I told Olivia the truth. Everything. The missing medication. The gas stove incident. The recordings. The pressure to sign financial documents. As I spoke, Olivia's face slowly filled with horror. "That's abuse," she whispered finally. The word hung in the air heavily. Abuse. I had spent months avoiding that truth because admitting it felt humiliating somehow. But she was right. Rebecca wasn't simply manipulative. She was psychologically dismantling me piece by piece, and Ethan allowed it. That realization still hurt most of all. The next morning, I called Harold Bennett. Harold had been Richard's closest friend for nearly 40 years and served as our family attorney since Ethan was a teenager. His voice immediately softened when he heard mine. "Daisy," he said gently. "I was wondering when you'd call. You already know. Ethan visited me 2 weeks ago." Ice slid through my stomach. "What?" Harold sighed heavily. "He wanted information about your estate planning." "Of course he did." I closed my eyes briefly. "And Rebecca." "She did most of the talking. That didn't surprise me at all." Harold's voice became more serious. "Daisy, are you safe?" The fact that he even asked that question made tears burn behind my eyes. "I think so." "You think so" isn't reassuring. I looked out toward the ocean quietly. Then I said something aloud for the first time. They were trying to make me look mentally incompetent. Silence. Then Harold spoke carefully. "Do you have proof?" I glanced toward Olivia in the kitchen making coffee. "Yes," I whispered. "I think I do." We arranged to meet 2 days later. After hanging up, I sat alone on the porch for nearly an hour thinking about the future. For months, I had focused entirely on surviving Rebecca. But now, another question slowly emerged inside me. What happened to everything I built after I was gone? Because suddenly, the answer no longer felt obvious. That evening, Olivia made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, while old jazz music played softly through the cottage radio. Simple, warm, safe. At one point, she accidentally burned one side of the bread and looked horrified. "I'm sorry," she groaned, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. A real laugh. The sound startled both of us. Olivia smiled slowly. There you are. 3 simple words, but they nearly made me cry. Because somewhere along the way, buried beneath manipulation and betrayal and loneliness, I had started disappearing. And somehow this young woman, with no obligation to love me at all, was helping me find myself again. That night before bed, I stood alone outside, listening to waves crash beneath moonlight. For the first time since leaving Savannah, I stopped feeling like a discarded mother and started realizing something unexpected. Family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes, family is the person who stays when everyone else leaves. I met Harold Bennett on a gray Monday morning inside his downtown Savannah office overlooking Reynolds Square. The same office Richard and I had walked into decades earlier when our company was still small enough to fit inside a single workshop. Back then, Harold had handled our first business contracts. Later, he handled Richard's will after the funeral. And now, somehow he was preparing to help me protect myself from my own son. Life can be brutally ironic. Harold looked older than I remembered. His silver hair had thinned and deep lines framed his mouth, but his eyes still carried the same sharp intelligence that made him one of the best attorneys in Georgia. The second I entered his office, he stood and hugged me tightly. "You've lost weight," he murmured. "So have you." He gave a tired smile. Stress does that at our age. But when we sat down across from each other, his expression turned serious immediately. "I need you to tell me everything." So I did. Everything. The financial pressure, the fake concern, the manipulation, Rebecca staging incidents to make me appear unstable, Ethan asking me to leave my own home. As I spoke, Harold's jaw tightened more and more. By the end, he looked furious. "That woman is dangerous," he said quietly. I stared down at my hands. The worst part is Ethan believed her. Harold leaned back heavily. People don't realize emotional manipulation can look a lot like love from the inside. That sentence stayed with me, because despite everything, part of me still wanted to believe Ethan wasn't cruel. Weak, yes. Blind, absolutely. But cruel, I wasn't ready to accept that fully yet. Harold opened a folder on his desk. "Your current estate plan leaves almost everything to Ethan." I nodded slowly. That was before. Before betrayal, before humiliation, before my own child watched me walk out of my house carrying one suitcase and did nothing to stop it. Harold studied me carefully. "You're certain you want to make changes?" The question should have been simple. Instead, it felt like grief. Because changing my will wasn't just paperwork. It was the acknowledgement that the future I imagined for my family no longer existed. I looked out the office window toward the old oak trees swaying outside. "When Richard died," I said softly, "everything I did was for Ethan." Harold stayed quiet. "I built the company bigger because I wanted his future secure." Tears burned behind my eyes. I protected every dollar because I thought one day it would protect him too. And now I swallowed hard. "Now I think money may have destroyed him." Silence settled heavily between us. Then Harold asked carefully, "What do you want to happen to your estate?" I wasn't prepared for how difficult that question would feel, because despite Rebecca's cruelty, despite Ethan's betrayal, part of me still loved my son desperately. Mothers don't stop loving their children simply because those children become disappointing, if only it were that easy. "I don't want Rebecca touching anything Richard and I built," I whispered. Harold nodded immediately. "That can absolutely be arranged. And Ethan?" My voice cracked slightly. "I can't reward what he's done." The pain in my chest felt unbearable saying those words aloud. Harold removed his glasses slowly. "You're not punishing him, Daisy." I looked at him uncertainly. "You're protecting yourself." Maybe, but it still felt like mourning. Then something unexpected happened. Harold glanced toward the waiting room outside his office, where Olivia sat quietly reading a magazine. "That young woman," he said carefully. "She seems devoted to you." I followed his gaze. Olivia looked completely out of place in Harold's elegant office. Nervous, humble, genuine. "She's been kinder to me than my own family." Harold nodded slowly. "Sometimes family arrives in unexpected forms." The words lingered in my mind long after he said them. For the next 2 hours, Harold carefully reviewed every asset Richard and I had built over our lifetime. The Savannah house, the company shares, investment accounts, the Hilton Head property, retirement funds, art collections, everything. Looking at it all listed on paper felt strangely surreal, an entire life reduced to documents and numbers. And suddenly, one terrifying realization hit me. Rebecca never truly saw me as a person. She saw an inventory. At one point, Harold paused and looked directly at me. "You could establish a charitable trust." I frowned slightly. "What kind?" "There are organizations across the country helping elderly women abandoned or financially abused by family members." The sentence hit me hard. Because until recently, I never imagined I would understand those women personally. Now, I understood them completely. The loneliness, the humiliation, the disbelief when your own child chooses someone else over you. I thought about the messages I'd secretly received over the years from older women connected to charity organizations. Stories about sons taking control of finances, daughters pressuring mothers into nursing homes, widows manipulated after losing spouses. I used to feel sympathy. Now I felt recognition. What if I began slowly, part of the estate funded something like that? Harold smiled faintly. "I think Richard would have admired that." That nearly broke me, because Richard would have hated what Ethan had become. But he also would have understood why I needed to protect myself now. Then Harold asked the question that truly changed everything. "And who do you trust?" I answered immediately. "Olivia." The word escaped before I fully processed it. Harold raised an eyebrow slightly. "Interesting." I stared toward the waiting room again. Olivia had no idea we were discussing her. She was just sitting there patiently, occasionally glancing up to make sure I was okay. No greed, no calculation, just concern. And suddenly, the contrast between her and Rebecca felt almost unbearable. One woman manipulated my son, isolated me, and tried to strip away my independence. The other quietly made soup when I cried. One woman treated my aging as an inconvenience. The other treated me like I still mattered. Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly. "I know how this sounds," I whispered. "No," Harold said softly. "Actually, I think it sounds perfectly clear." By late afternoon, the new documents were ready. My hands trembled slightly as I reviewed them. The revisions were enormous. Ethan would still receive a modest inheritance enough to prove this wasn't revenge. But the majority of the estate would transfer elsewhere, to a charitable foundation supporting vulnerable older women, and to Olivia Carter. Not because she manipulated me, not because she expected it, but because kindness deserves protection too. Harold handed me the pen carefully. "You can take time to think," but I already had. For months, every cruel comment, every humiliating moment, every second Ethan chose silence while Rebecca tore me apart. I signed my name slowly. Daisy Marshall. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, something inside me shifted. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Freedom. For the first time in nearly a year, I no longer felt powerless. Harold finalized the paperwork and locked copies inside his office safe. No one can challenge these changes easily, he assured me, especially with the evidence you've documented. I nodded slowly, but as we stood to leave, grief suddenly washed over me anyway. Because no matter how justified the decision was, no mother dreams of rewriting her legacy this way. Outside the office, rain had begun falling softly across Savannah's old brick streets. Olivia immediately opened an umbrella over my head before covering herself. That tiny gesture nearly shattered me emotionally, because she protected me instinctively, not strategically. As we walked toward the car, Olivia glanced at me nervously. "Everything okay?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I smiled sadly. "Yes," I whispered. But deep inside, I knew something irreversible had just happened. That morning, Ethan Marshall had still been the future heir to everything Richard and I built. By sunset, he no longer was. Rebecca found out about the will change 3 weeks later. To this day, I still don't know exactly how. Maybe Ethan overheard something during one of his calls with Harold. Maybe Rebecca searched through private documents when she realized I was no longer behaving like a frightened old woman. Or maybe manipulative people simply develop instincts for when control begins slipping away. Whatever the reason, the phone call came at 7:12 on a Tuesday evening while Olivia and I were eating dinner on the cottage porch. The second I saw Ethan's name appear on my phone screen, my stomach tightened. I answered carefully. "Hello, Mom," Ethan said sharply. "Did you change your will?" No greeting, no concern. Straight to the money. That alone told me Rebecca was sitting beside him listening. I set my fork down slowly. That's an interesting first question after weeks of silence. Harold called about legal paperwork. Of course he had. Harold likely needed signatures finalized on certain company documents, which meant Ethan noticed changes somewhere in the process. I looked out toward the dark ocean waves. "Yes," I answered calmly. I updated my estate plan. Silence exploded on the other end. Then Rebecca's voice suddenly appeared in the background. I knew it. Not grief, not shock. Anger. Pure anger. Ethan lowered his voice. "Mom, what exactly did you do?" I almost laughed at the wording, as if protecting myself were some kind of crime. "I made decisions about my own property. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Rebecca grabbed the phone. I could practically hear it happen. "Daisy," she snapped, dropping the fake sweetness completely for the first time after everything Ethan has done for you, "this is unbelievably cruel." I stared into the darkness beyond the porch railing. Everything Ethan has done for me. The irony nearly made me sick. "You mean forcing me out of my own home?" I asked quietly. "You're being dramatic." "No," I replied coldly. "I'm finally being honest." Rebecca's breathing sharpened angrily. "You are not mentally well enough to be making decisions like this." There it was. The real plan finally exposed. I felt Olivia tense beside me immediately. "You should be very careful saying things like that," I warned. Rebecca laughed harshly. Maybe someone should have been careful before manipulating an elderly woman into rewriting legal documents. My entire body went cold, because suddenly I understood exactly what was happening. They weren't going to let this go. Ethan came back on the line quickly. "Mom, nobody's accusing anybody. We just think maybe you've been influenced." Influenced. By kindness, perhaps. By basic human decency. The hypocrisy was staggering. "I'm tired, Ethan. You need to reconsider this." "No." The word came out firmer than I expected. Then silence. Heavy. Dangerous silence. Finally, Ethan spoke again, but this time his voice sounded strangely distant. Rebecca thinks we may need to challenge the will. There are moments when reality becomes so painful, it almost feels unreal. Hearing my own son discuss legal action against me while I sat eating soup in a small seaside cottage was one of those moments. "You're going to sue your mother," I whispered. "It's not like that." But it was exactly like that. Rebecca interrupted again from somewhere nearby. "She's obviously unstable." That sentence lit something inside me. Not fear, not sadness. Fury. "I am not unstable," I said sharply. "But if you continue making false accusations about my mental health, I will defend myself aggressively." The line went quiet immediately, because for the first time they heard strength instead of confusion. And manipulators hate resistance. Ethan ended the call abruptly a few moments later. But the damage was already done. Olivia looked horrified after I lowered the phone. "They're really going to fight you over this?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." She shook her head in disbelief. "How can people do this to family?" I thought about that question for a long time. The answer arrived painfully. Because some people stop seeing family as human beings once money becomes involved. The next morning, Harold called before breakfast. "They contacted me," he said immediately. I closed my eyes. I figured. Rebecca did most of the talking. Of course she did. She's threatening to challenge your competency legally. The word competency made my stomach turn. At 68 years old, after decades of running a successful business, raising a child, managing investments, and surviving widowhood, I was suddenly being treated like an incapable old woman because I refused to hand over my wealth. Harold's tone sharpened. "They're claiming Olivia manipulated you." Olivia nearly dropped her coffee mug when she overheard that. What she whispered. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "None of this is your fault." But the fear in her eyes hurt me deeply. Because kind people aren't built for ugly battles like this. Harold continued speaking. "I need you prepared for what comes next. And what exactly is that legal petition questioning your mental fitness?" My chest tightened. And if they succeed, they could potentially freeze financial control temporarily pending evaluation. Jesus. Rebecca wasn't simply angry about the inheritance anymore. She wanted complete control. Harold lowered his voice carefully. "Daisy, do you have all the recordings and evidence secured?" "Yes." "Good, because this situation is escalating. Escalating." That word barely covered it. Over the next several days, things turned vicious quickly. Rebecca began spreading rumors through Savannah social circles that I was suffering cognitive decline. Old family friends suddenly sounded awkward on the phone. One woman even gently suggested I rest more. The humiliation burned. Rebecca also started contacting people connected to the company. Employees, board members, investors, quietly planting seeds of doubt about my mental state. The cruelty of it shocked even me. And Ethan. God. Ethan let it happen. That betrayal wounded me more deeply than any legal threat ever could. 3 days later, official court documents arrived at the cottage. Olivia brought them inside with pale hands. I already knew what they were before opening them. Petition for competency evaluation, filed jointly by Ethan Marshall. At the bottom sat Rebecca's signature as witness. My vision blurred briefly. Not because I feared losing the case, because seeing my son's name on those papers felt like attending the funeral of the boy I raised. Olivia sat beside me carefully. "You don't deserve this." I stared at the documents silently. "No," I whispered. But I think this was always where Rebecca intended things to end. That night, I barely slept. Memories kept replaying endlessly in my mind. Teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle, helping him study for exams, holding him after Richard died. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every prayer. And somehow, it still ended here, with my own child questioning my sanity because his wife wanted my money. Around 2 a.m, I walked alone down to the shoreline outside the cottage. The ocean wind felt cold against my skin. For a brief, terrible moment, exhaustion overwhelmed me completely. I was tired of fighting, tired of proving my worth, tired of defending my own reality. But then I remembered Rebecca's voice saying, "She'll either sign everything over or end up in assisted living anyway." And suddenly, something hardened inside me. No, I would not allow that woman to erase me. Not quietly, not politely, not ever. The next morning, Harold arrived at the cottage carrying several legal folders. He looked grim. "This is going to get ugly." I nodded calmly. "Then we fight ugly." For the first time since this nightmare began, Harold smiled slightly. "There's the Daisy Marshall I remember." Olivia stood beside me silently, while sea wind moved through the porch screens. And in that moment, I realized something important. Rebecca believed age made me weak, but she forgot something dangerous. I didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by surrendering easily, and if she wanted a war over my life, my dignity, and my future, then she had just declared war against the wrong woman. The competency hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning inside the Chatham County Courthouse in Savannah. I wore navy blue, not because I cared about appearances anymore, but because Richard once told me blue made me look strongest when I was angry. And that morning, beneath all the grief and exhaustion, I was furious. The courthouse smelled like old paper-polished wood and tension. Olivia walked beside me carrying folders filled with evidence while Harold moved ahead of us speaking quietly with court staff. Everything suddenly felt surreal. 1 year earlier, my biggest concerns involved furniture shipments and charity galas. Now I was preparing to defend my sanity against my own son. As we entered the courtroom, I saw Ethan immediately. My heart still reacted instinctively at the sight of him. That's motherhood for you. Painfully loyal, even when loyalty is no longer deserved. He looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes, wrinkled shirt, nervous hands. For a brief moment, I saw flashes of the boy who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares. Then Rebecca touched his arm, and his entire posture changed. She looked immaculate in a cream-colored suit with perfect makeup and carefully arranged concern painted across her face. Not fear, not guilt, confidence, because Rebecca genuinely believed she would win. When her eyes landed on me, she offered a small, sympathetic smile so fake it made my stomach turn. I ignored her completely. The hearing itself was technically private, but word had still spread through Savannah social circles. Several familiar faces lingered outside the courtroom, pretending not to stare. Humiliation burned hot beneath my skin. Not because I was ashamed, because Rebecca had successfully transformed my private pain into public entertainment. Once proceedings began, the judge reviewed the petition calmly. Then Rebecca's attorney stood. He spoke in smooth, measured language that made me sound fragile, confused, emotionally unstable, and vulnerable to manipulation. They described me as an elderly widow experiencing emotional deterioration, a woman isolated from long-time family support, a person displaying impulsive financial behavior. Impulsive. Interesting word for decisions I spent months considering. Then came the worst part. They implied Olivia manipulated me for financial gain. I watched Olivia's face pale beside me. The cruelty of it made my chest ache. This young woman had shown me more compassion in months than my own family. And now, Rebecca was trying to destroy her too. When Ethan finally testified, I could barely breathe. Because part of me still hoped he would stop this madness before it went too far. Instead, he avoided my eyes and said quietly, "I'm just worried about my mother." That sentence nearly shattered me. Not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded sincere. Rebecca had manipulated him so thoroughly, he genuinely believed himself to be the hero in this story. That realization was devastating. Then Rebecca took the stand. And for the first time since entering my life, she dropped the mask too far. She spoke with polished sadness about my decline. She described the stove incident, the missing medication, my paranoia. Then she sighed dramatically and said, "We only wanted Daisy to be safe." Safe. The audacity almost made me laugh. Harold finally rose from his chair slowly, and everything changed. "Mrs. Collins Marshall," he said calmly, "you testified that Daisy Marshall frequently misplaced important items due to confusion, correct?" Rebecca nodded gracefully. "Yes, and you're certain those incidents reflected cognitive decline?" "Absolutely." Harold opened a folder carefully. "Interesting." Something in his voice made Rebecca shift slightly for the first time. Harold pressed a button on a small speaker sitting beside him. The courtroom filled with Rebecca's voice instantly. If Ethan would stop feeling guilty, this would all be easier. She's old. Eventually, she'll either sign everything over or end up in assisted living anyway. Silence exploded across the courtroom. Rebecca froze completely. Ethan looked like someone had punched him in the chest. Harold calmly stopped the recording. "Would you like to explain that statement, Mrs. Collins Marshall?" Rebecca's face drained white. "That recording was illegally obtained." "Actually," Harold replied smoothly, "Georgia is a one-party consent state." The judge leaned forward immediately. Rebecca's attorney looked alarmed now. Harold continued, "We also have additional recordings." Another clip played. This time, Rebecca's voice sounded colder. "She's getting worse. Honestly, it's only a matter of time before Ethan agrees she can't live alone anymore." Ethan slowly turned toward his wife. I watched confusion begin cracking through his certainty for the first time. Harold wasn't finished. Next came photographs. Medication hidden in impossible places. Time-stamped security images from my kitchen. And finally, video footage. Olivia had secretly recorded Rebecca turning the stove knob herself before leaving the kitchen. The second the video appeared on screen, the entire courtroom went silent. Rebecca stopped breathing. Ethan stared at the footage in horror. And I felt something inside me finally stop trembling, because truth has power when it's finally dragged into light. Rebecca suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. She manipulated all of this, but her composure was cracking now. Harold remained calm. Manipulated herself into being psychologically abused, Rebecca's attorney whispered urgently beside her. Too late. The damage was done. Then Harold called Olivia to testify. Poor Olivia looked terrified walking to the stand, but the moment she began speaking, her honesty filled the room completely. She described the missing medication. Rebecca moving objects, the gaslighting, the emotional isolation, the pressure surrounding my finances. At one point, Olivia's voice cracked. "I watched Mrs. Marshall start doubting her own memory," she whispered. "And it broke my heart because she wasn't confused. She was being manipulated." I looked down immediately because tears burned too fiercely behind my eyes. The judge listened carefully throughout all of it, and slowly, The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Rebecca sensed it too. Her confidence disappeared entirely. Then came the moment that changed everything permanently. Harold turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Marshall," he said carefully, "did you know your wife was staging incidents to support claims of mental instability against your mother?" Ethan looked shattered. No. Harold pressed gently. "Did you know she discussed assisted living placement before any formal medical diagnosis existed?" "No." "Did you know she described your mother as an obstacle to inheritance?" Ethan's breathing became uneven. "No." The final word barely came out, and suddenly I saw it happening in real time. The illusion Rebecca built around him was collapsing. Painfully, publicly, completely. Rebecca reached for his arm. "Ethan," but he pulled away, just slightly. Still, I noticed. The judge eventually called a recess before issuing a preliminary ruling. No evidence supported mental incompetence. None. Instead, substantial evidence suggested manipulation and emotional coercion against me. Rebecca looked stunned. Actually stunned. Because manipulators often believe they're smarter than consequences. As people slowly exited the courtroom, Ethan remained frozen in his chair, staring at the evidence table. The recordings, the photographs, the proof. Proof his wife lied. Proof his mother told the truth. Proof he had failed to protect the person who spent her entire life protecting him. I stood slowly, emotionally exhausted beyond words. Rebecca suddenly turned toward me with naked hatred in her eyes. Not embarrassment, not regret. Hatred. Because I survived her. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. Rebecca never truly underestimated my intelligence. She underestimated my willingness to fight back. As Olivia helped gather our folders, Ethan finally looked at me directly. For the first time in nearly a year, I saw fear in my son's eyes. Not fear of losing money. Fear that he may have destroyed his relationship with me forever. And honestly, he was right to be afraid. After the hearing, Ethan started calling me every day. At first, I didn't answer. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I genuinely didn't know what to say to him anymore. How do you speak normally to someone who stood in court questioning your sanity? How do you separate the son you raised from the man who let his wife psychologically destroy you? Some wounds don't close simply because the truth comes out. Sometimes truth makes them deeper. 3 days after the hearing, Ethan drove to the cottage unannounced. I saw his truck pull into the gravel driveway just after sunset, while Olivia and I were bringing laundry inside before the rain started. The second Olivia noticed him, she looked at me carefully. "You want me to tell him to leave?" Part of me did. God part of me absolutely did. But another part, the foolish, aching mother part, still wanted answers. "No," I whispered. "It's okay." Ethan stepped out slowly. He looked terrible. Not polished, not confident, broken. For the first time in months, Rebecca wasn't beside him. That alone felt strange. He approached the porch cautiously, like a man walking toward a wild animal he had already wounded once before. "Mom." I folded my arms tightly against the cold wind. "What do you want, Ethan?" His face crumpled slightly at the distance in my voice. "I need to talk to you." Olivia glanced at me once more before quietly heading inside to give us privacy. The silence between us felt unbearable. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I didn't know." I laughed softly, not cruelly, just tired. "You didn't know your wife was trying to convince people I was losing my mind?" Pain flashed across his face. She manipulated me too. There it was. The explanation. The excuse. The thing he'd probably repeated to himself 1,000 times since the courtroom. I looked out toward the dark ocean. "Do you know what hurt most?" I asked quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "What not, Rebecca?" That surprised him. "She's greedy, manipulative, cruel." I shrugged slightly. "Women like her exist everywhere." I finally looked directly at him. "But you—" My voice cracked. "You were my son." Tears instantly filled his eyes. "I know." "No," I whispered. "You really don't." The wind moved through the porch screens softly, while both of us stood there drowning in things too painful to fully say aloud. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "There's something you need to hear." His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked it. I frowned. "What is it?" His voice broke. A conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. He pressed play. Rebecca's voice filled the quiet porch immediately. Sharp, cold, unrecognizable from the polished woman she pretended to be publicly. "I'm telling you once the court rules in our favor, Ethan's mother won't have any choice anymore." Another woman's voice responded faintly through speakerphone, and Rebecca laughed. "Please. Ethan does whatever I tell him eventually." My chest tightened. Ethan stared at the floor in shame. The recording continued. "She's old. The company should have belonged to Ethan years ago anyway. Honestly, I'm tired of waiting for that woman to die." Silence crashed over the porch. For a second, all I could hear was ocean waves and Ethan's uneven breathing. Then he whispered, "I didn't know she talked about you like that." I closed my eyes briefly, but deep down, I think part of him always knew. He just didn't want to see it. Ethan sat heavily in one of the porch chairs and buried his face in his hands. I destroyed everything. The raw pain in his voice hit me harder than I expected. Because despite all the anger inside me, I still loved him. That was the tragedy of it all. "I trusted her," he whispered. I leaned against the porch railing quietly. Why he looked up slowly. She made me feel needed. The honesty in his answer stunned me. "She always said you were strong enough without me," he continued. "That you controlled everything. That there was no room for me in your life unless I fought for it." I stared at him silently. Rebecca hadn't only manipulated my son's greed. She manipulated his insecurities. And suddenly, pieces of Ethan's behavior began rearranging themselves differently in my mind. Not excused, but explained. "She convinced me you saw me as weak," he admitted quietly. My heart cracked hearing that. Because nothing could have been further from the truth. You were the reason I survived losing your father. Tears slid down Ethan's face instantly. "I know that now. I wanted to ask, do you really understand what you did to me?" "Instead," I said softly, "you let her humiliate me." He nodded immediately. "I know. You watched me leave my own home carrying one suitcase." His shoulders shook slightly. "I know. You questioned my sanity." At that, Ethan completely broke. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Mom? God, I'm so sorry." And suddenly, he looked young again. Not physically, emotionally. Like the frightened little boy who used to cry after making mistakes he didn't know how to fix. But this wasn't a broken vase or failed school test. This was betrayal. Adult betrayal. The kind that permanently changes relationships. I sat down across from him slowly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Ethan looked toward the cottage windows, where warm kitchen light glowed behind the curtains. Olivia stayed. It wasn't really a question. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "She barely knew you." And she stayed. There was so much self-hatred in his voice that I almost reached for him instinctively. Almost. But grief held me still. Finally, Ethan whispered, "Why I thought about that carefully," then answered honestly, "Because kindness isn't about obligation." The sentence hit him visibly. And maybe that was necessary, because Ethan spent months believing loyalty belonged automatically to blood and marriage. Now he was learning something painful. Real love reveals itself through action. Not titles, not promises. Action. The porch fell silent again until Ethan finally looked at me with desperate eyes. "Can you ever forgive me?" There it was. The question hanging between us both. I wanted forgiveness to be simple, clean, immediate. But some pain reshapes you too deeply for that. "I don't know," I answered truthfully. The honesty crushed him. But lies would have been crueler. "I love you," I whispered. Nothing changes that. Fresh tears filled his eyes. But love and trust are not the same thing anymore. He lowered his head immediately. And that was the moment I think Ethan finally understood the true cost of what he'd allowed Rebecca to do. Not money, not inheritance. Me. Around midnight, Ethan stood slowly to leave. He looked emotionally hollowed out. Before walking toward his truck, he paused. "I left Rebecca. That surprised me." "When yesterday?" I studied his face carefully. "She blamed everyone except herself," he whispered. "Even after the hearing." I nodded slowly. Because people like Rebecca rarely feel genuine remorse. Only anger when control disappears. Ethan hesitated one final time before speaking again. "I know I don't deserve another chance right now." No, he didn't. But I want to become someone Dad would have respected again. That sentence nearly shattered me completely, because Richard would have been devastated by all of this. But he also would have wanted our son to find his way back before it was too late. I watched Ethan drive away beneath the dark coastal sky, while emotions twisted painfully inside my chest. Part of me wanted to run after him. Part of me still wanted to scream. And part of me finally understood something heartbreaking. Rebecca hadn't just stolen my peace. For a while, she stole my son too. 2 weeks after Ethan left, Rebecca Harold called me just after sunrise. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Daisy," he said immediately, "I think you need to come into Savannah today." My stomach tightened. What happened? There are financial irregularities involving Ethan and Rebecca's joint accounts. I sat upright slowly in bed. "What kind of irregularities?" Harold paused carefully. "The kind that suggest Rebecca was preparing an exit strategy long before the hearing." A cold feeling moved through my chest instantly. Because deep down, I already knew what that meant. Rebecca never truly loved Ethan. She loved access, status, money. And now that control was slipping away, she was protecting herself. I drove into Savannah with Olivia beside me, while rain streaked across the windshield. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. Somehow, the silence felt safer than saying the truth aloud. When we arrived at Harold's office, Ethan was already there. He looked worse than before. Exhausted, unshaven, like someone barely sleeping. The second he saw me enter, shame flashed across his face. That expression alone told me things were bad. Harold closed the office door carefully behind us. Then he slid several printed bank statements across the desk. Ethan stared at them like they were poison. "What am I looking at?" I asked quietly. Harold adjusted his glasses. "Rebecca opened multiple private accounts over the last 18 months. 18 months? My stomach dropped. That timeline meant she started preparing long before the competency hearing ever happened, maybe even before forcing me out. Harold pointed toward highlighted transactions. Large transfers were made from Ethan and Rebecca's shared financial accounts. I looked toward Ethan sharply. "You didn't know," he laughed bitterly. "No." The sound broke my heart a little, because this man sitting in front of me barely resembled the confident son who once defended his wife against everyone else. He looked devastated, humiliated. Harold continued carefully. Some funds were also connected to business reimbursements Rebecca wasn't authorized to access. My blood ran cold. "She stole from the company indirectly," Harold answered. "It appears she manipulated Ethan into approving certain transfers he believed were legitimate." Ethan buried his face in his hands instantly. "Oh my God." I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. All those months, Rebecca accused me of instability. She had been quietly building her own financial escape route, preparing for failure, preparing for divorce, preparing for life after destroying my family. The realization made me feel physically sick. Ethan's voice cracked. "She told me we were investing." Harold's expression softened slightly. She was lying. Silence filled the office heavily. Then Ethan whispered the sentence that shattered me completely. "I ruined my relationship with my mother for someone who was planning to rob me." No one answered, because there was nothing left to say. Eventually, Harold slid another folder across the desk. "There's more." I almost didn't want to open it, but I did. Inside sat printed emails, private correspondence, Rebecca communicating with a luxury realtor in Miami, discussions about penthouse apartments, questions about transferring assets discreetly. One message made my chest tighten instantly. "Once Ethan gets control of the Marshall estate, we'll finally have real freedom." Real freedom. As if my existence had been some burden standing between Rebecca and wealth. Ethan looked physically ill reading the messages. "She planned all of this." "Yes," Harold said quietly, "and I helped her." The self-hatred in his voice was unbearable. Part of me wanted to comfort him instinctively, but another part remembered standing in court while my own son questioned my sanity. Some wounds don't disappear simply because someone finally regrets causing them. Olivia sat quietly beside me, watching everything unfold with sad eyes. I think she understood something important before the rest of us did. Rebecca wasn't motivated by love, or anger, or insecurity. She was motivated entirely by ambition, and people like that rarely stop willingly. Then Harold delivered the final blow. She attempted another transfer yesterday. Ethan looked up sharply. "What?" Harold nodded grimly. "Large enough to trigger fraud review." My heart pounded. Was she successful? No. For the first time all morning, I saw actual relief cross Ethan's face. Then Harold added quietly, "But she disappeared immediately afterward." The room froze. "What do you mean, disappeared?" I asked. "She emptied personal belongings from the Savannah house yesterday afternoon." Ethan's face went white. "She told me she was staying with a friend." Harold sighed heavily. "I don't believe Rebecca plans on returning." And suddenly, the truth landed fully. Rebecca wasn't fighting for her marriage anymore. She was escaping before consequences trapped her. Ethan stood abruptly and paced toward the office windows. His breathing looked uneven. I defended her against my own mother. No one interrupted him. "I accused you of paranoia," he whispered toward me. "And all along, she was lying to both of us." Tears burned behind my eyes despite everything. Because watching your child suffer still hurts even when they helped create the disaster themselves. I'm sorry, he whispered again. The words sounded emptier now. Not because he didn't mean them, because guilt can't undo damage already done. Hours later, Ethan insisted on returning to the Savannah house to see for himself what Rebecca had taken. I agreed to go, partly because I needed closure too. The moment we entered the house, grief crashed into me unexpectedly. Everything looked wrong, cold, lifeless. The warmth Richard and I spent decades building there felt completely gone. Rebecca's closet upstairs stood half empty, jewelry missing, designer luggage gone, several framed wedding photographs removed from shelves. Like she had already erased Ethan emotionally before physically leaving him. Ethan stood silently inside the bedroom for several minutes. Then he noticed something near the dresser. An envelope. His hands shook opening it. Inside sat a single, handwritten note. Ethan, you were too weak to do what needed to be done. I got tired of waiting for your mother to let go of control. Maybe someday you'll understand that people like Daisy never willingly step aside. You chose guilt over ambition. I chose myself. Rebecca. I watched my son completely break. Not loudly, not dramatically. Something quieter, more devastating. Like a human being realizing the last year of his life had been built on manipulation and illusion. He sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, staring at the note. She never loved me. I closed my eyes briefly. No, I whispered honestly. I don't think she did. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then Ethan looked around the room slowly, at the expensive furniture, the marble fireplace, the luxury Rebecca obsessed over, and finally he whispered, she would have destroyed all of us eventually. Yes, she would have. That realization settled heavily between us. Later that evening, after returning to the cottage, Ethan sat alone on the porch for a long time, watching waves crash against the shoreline. Eventually, I joined him quietly. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then, Ethan finally said, I don't know who I became. The pain in his voice felt genuine. Not performative, not defensive, just broken. I thought carefully before answering. You became someone who stopped listening to people who truly loved you. Tears filled his eyes immediately. And maybe that was the most tragic part of all. Rebecca didn't only steal money, or trust, or peace. For a while, she stole Ethan from himself too. Winter arrived quietly along the Georgia coast. The tourist crowds disappeared. The beaches grew emptier, and cold ocean wind rattled the cottage windows at night hard enough to wake me sometimes. Strangely, I didn't mind the silence anymore. For the first time in over a year, peace no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. By December, life had settled into a rhythm that almost resembled healing. Almost. Olivia started helping Harold organize paperwork for the charitable foundation we planned to launch. She approached every task with careful determination, as if terrified of disappointing me. I think part of her still couldn't believe someone trusted her with something meaningful. And Ethan was trying. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just honestly. After Rebecca disappeared, he moved into a small apartment outside Savannah instead of returning to the family house. He stepped away from most company decisions temporarily and started attending therapy twice a week. At first, I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted distance. Another part watched my son unravel beneath guilt and remembered that broken people sometimes need compassion most when they least deserve it. Still, forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, and trust does not magically return simply because someone apologizes enough. One cold Saturday afternoon, Ethan arrived at the cottage carrying groceries and firewood without calling first. Old habits, the kind he used to have before Rebecca entered our lives. Olivia opened the door and smiled politely. He's outside, with enough soup ingredients to feed an army. I almost laughed. Almost. When I stepped onto the porch, Ethan looked up nervously from unloading bags out of his truck. Hey! Hi! The awkwardness between us still hurt, but it no longer felt poisonous. Just sad. He carried the groceries inside while I lit a fire in the living room fireplace. Watching him move through the cottage brought back painful memories of happier years. Richard teaching him how to stack wood properly, family movie nights, stormy weekends spent playing cards while rain hit the roof. Grief has a cruel way of layering old memories over present pain until you barely know which emotion belongs where. Later that evening, the three of us ate homemade soup while soft jazz music played quietly in the background. At one point, Olivia laughed at something Ethan said, and the sound startled me. Because it felt normal, not forced, not tense, just human. After dinner, Olivia excused herself upstairs to finish paperwork, leaving Ethan and me alone beside the fire. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. I sold the house. I looked up sharply. The Savannah house. He nodded slowly. I couldn't stay there. Something in his voice made my chest ache. That house carried too many ghosts now. Betrayal, manipulation, humiliation, and maybe for Ethan shame. What will happen to it? I asked quietly. A family from Atlanta bought it. I stared into the fire silently. Part of me expected that news to devastate me. Instead, I felt strangely detached, because the truth was painful, but simple. The house stopped being home long before I ever left it. Ethan leaned forward slowly. I need to tell you something. His voice sounded serious enough that I immediately tensed. What is it? He swallowed hard. I spoke to Harold yesterday. My stomach tightened slightly, and he explained the final structure of your estate. Ah, there it was. The conversation we both knew would eventually come. I waited quietly. Ethan looked directly at me. You kept the will exactly the same. Not accusation. Just sadness. Yes. He nodded slowly, absorbing the answer. I understand why. I studied him carefully. Do you? His eyes filled with emotion instantly. I do now. The fire crackled softly between us. Then Ethan whispered, I spent so much time thinking love guaranteed entitlement. That sentence hit me deeply, because it was true. Somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped viewing inheritance as a gift and started viewing it as inevitability. Rebecca simply exploited that weakness. I failed you, he continued quietly. Not because Rebecca manipulated me. He shook his head slowly. Because I allowed myself to believe protecting my marriage mattered more than protecting my mother. Tears burned behind my eyes. Hearing him finally say it aloud mattered more than I expected. No excuses. No blaming Rebecca entirely. Just truth. And truth, even painful truth, is where healing begins. I kept waiting for you to choose me, I whispered. Ethan lowered his head immediately. I know. You watched me become smaller every month. Fresh tears slid down his face. I know. I needed my son. At that, Ethan completely broke down. Not controlled crying, not quiet guilt. Real grief. The kind that comes when someone finally sees the full damage they caused. I'm sorry, he whispered over and over. Mom, I'm so sorry. For a moment, all I could see was the little boy who used to cry after nightmares and climb into my bed because he believed I could protect him from anything. Life changes so strangely. Eventually, children grow older, and become the ones capable of hurting you most. I moved closer slowly and placed my hand over his. "I do forgive you," I whispered. Ethan looked up immediately stunned, but before hope could fully reach his eyes, I continued. "That doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was." His face crumpled slightly, and that was the hardest truth of all. Forgiveness does not erase consequences. It simply prevents bitterness from destroying what remains. "I can love you," I said softly, "without handing you control over my life again." Ethan nodded slowly through tears. "I understand," and surprisingly, I believed him, not because he suddenly became perfect, but because pain finally humbled him enough to listen. Later that night, after Olivia went to bed, Ethan helped me clean dishes in the kitchen. At one point, he looked around the small cottage quietly. "You seem happier here." The statement surprised me. I dried one of the plates slowly before answering. "I think I finally stopped trying to earn love from people who should have given it freely." Ethan closed his eyes briefly at that. Another painful truth, but necessary. Before leaving, he paused beside the front door nervously. "Do you think Dad would hate me?" The question nearly shattered me. I stepped closer carefully. "Your father would be disappointed." Ethan lowered his eyes, but I continued softly. "He would also want you to become better instead of staying broken." Tears filled his eyes again. "I'm trying, I know, and maybe that was enough for now. Not redemption, not restoration, just effort, real effort." I watched Ethan drive away beneath the cold winter sky while emotions twisted quietly inside my chest. The pain between us wasn't gone. Maybe part of it never would be. But for the first time since Rebecca entered our lives, I no longer felt like I was losing my son. Instead, slowly and painfully, I felt like he was finally finding his way back. 1 year later, the cottage no longer felt like a place I escaped to. It felt like home. The white paint had been refreshed. Olivia planted lavender beside the porch steps. Wind chimes hung near the windows softly singing whenever ocean breeze rolled in from the shore. Peace lived there now. Real peace, not the fragile kind built on pretending everything is perfect. The honest kind that arrives only after surviving heartbreak. Most mornings I woke before sunrise and sat on the porch wrapped in one of Richard's old sweaters while watching light spread slowly across the water. At 69 years old, I finally understood something younger versions of myself never did. A quiet life is not an empty life, it's a blessed one. The foundation Harold helped us establish had grown far beyond anything I originally imagined. We named it the Marshall House Foundation, a support organization for elderly women facing financial abuse, abandonment, or emotional manipulation by family members. Women just like me. At first, I worried no one would come. I was wrong. The letters started arriving within weeks. Stories from widows abandoned after signing over property. Mothers pushed into nursing homes after transferring assets to children. Grandmothers isolated from friends, while relatives quietly drained bank accounts. Every letter broke my heart. But they also reminded me why surviving Rebecca mattered. Pain becomes something meaningful when it helps protect someone else from suffering alone. Olivia became the soul of the foundation almost immediately. Not because of the inheritance, because of her heart. She listened to every woman who walked through our office doors like their story genuinely mattered. She remembered birthdays, returned late-night calls, sat beside frightened women during legal consultations. People trusted her instinctively. I did too. One afternoon, I stood quietly outside her office while she comforted an elderly woman whose son had stolen retirement savings. Olivia held the woman's trembling hands and said softly, "You are not a burden, and you are not crazy." The words nearly brought tears to my eyes. Because once upon a time, someone needed to say those exact words to me too. And now, somehow healing was spreading outward from our pain into other people's lives. Funny how suffering works sometimes. Ethan started volunteering at the foundation 6 months earlier. At first, I resisted the idea completely. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Trust rebuilds slowly after betrayal, painfully slowly. But Harold surprised me one afternoon during lunch. "He's changing," he said quietly. I looked skeptical. People don't change that easily. No, Harold agreed, but guilt changes people faster than comfort ever does. And maybe he was right, because Ethan never asked for money again, never questioned the will again, never pressured me about inheritance. Instead, he showed up quietly every week, carrying donation boxes, helping repair office furniture, organizing transport for elderly clients who couldn't drive themselves. He listened now. Really listened. One afternoon, I watched him sit for nearly 2 hours with an 80-year-old veteran's widow who simply needed someone to hear her story. The old Ethan would have checked his phone constantly. This Ethan stayed fully present. That mattered to me more than he probably realized. Healing between us came slowly. There were still awkward silences sometimes, still moments where grief flashed unexpectedly between us. But there was honesty now too, and honesty is stronger than performance. Rebecca disappeared entirely from our lives. Occasionally rumors surfaced. Miami, Chicago, a wealthy businessman in Dallas. People like Rebecca rarely stay still very long. They move toward opportunity the way sharks move toward blood. Oddly enough, I stopped feeling angry about her eventually. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hatred felt too exhausting after everything. Rebecca taught me painful lessons about greed, manipulation, weakness. But she also unintentionally forced me to reclaim parts of myself I had abandoned long before she entered our lives. Strength, boundaries, self-worth outside motherhood. One warm spring evening, Ethan and I sat together on the cottage porch, watching waves roll against the shore, while Olivia cooked dinner inside. The sky glowed pink and gold. Beautiful enough to hurt. "I used to think success meant inheriting what you built," Ethan admitted quietly. I looked toward him carefully. "And now?" He smiled sadly. "Now I think success means becoming someone worthy of trust." The answer surprised me. Not because it sounded wise, because he finally understood something money could never teach him. Character matters more than inheritance. I reached over slowly and squeezed his hand. A simple gesture, but one that took us both a long time to earn again. "You know," he said after a while, for months after Rebecca left, "I kept thinking about that day you walked out of the house." Pain moved quietly through me even now. I still hate myself for it. I looked out toward the ocean. "You should." He blinked in surprise. Then slowly, I smiled faintly. "And you should also keep becoming better, because of it." Emotion filled his eyes immediately. That's the thing about real accountability. It isn't about endless punishment. It's about transformation. Later that night, after Ethan left Olivia and I cleaned dishes together, while jazz music played softly through the kitchen, she glanced toward me carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret changing the will?" Interesting question. I dried my hands slowly before answering. No. And I meant it. Not because Ethan deserved nothing, but because inheritance should reflect values, not guilt. Olivia looked uncertain. But your son. My son still has something more important than money. I interrupted gently. She frowned slightly. What a second chance to become a good man. Silence settled softly between us. Then Olivia smiled, and suddenly I realized something extraordinary. This little cottage held more warmth now than my mansion ever did, because love finally lived here honestly, not conditionally, not manipulatively, honestly. That night before bed, I walked alone onto the beach while moonlight stretched silver across the water. I thought about Richard, about grief, about motherhood, about how close I came to disappearing beneath someone else's control. And I thought about the strange, unexpected beauty of surviving. Because survival changes you, sometimes painfully, sometimes permanently, but if you're lucky, it also teaches you who truly belongs in your life. I used to believe family was built through blood. Now I know better. Family is built through loyalty, through kindness, through the people who stay when loving you becomes difficult. My son chose a greedy woman over me once. And yes, for a while, he lost everything that truly mattered because of it. But in the end, this story was never really about inheritance. It was about learning that love without respect eventually becomes destruction, and respect without kindness is worthless. As for me, I didn't choose a new heir because I stopped loving my son. I chose a new heir because I finally learned to love myself too. After everything that happened, I learned something I wish more people understood before it's too late. Love should never require you to disappear in order to keep someone else comfortable. For a long time, I confused sacrifice with unconditional acceptance. I thought being a good mother meant enduring anything silently so my son could stay happy. I excused disrespect because I was afraid of losing him. I ignored my instincts because I wanted peace more than truth. But silence can become dangerous when it protects the wrong people. What Rebecca did to me was cruel, but what hurt most was watching my own child slowly stop seeing me as a human being deserving of dignity. And sadly, that happens to many older parents. People begin treating them like burdens instead of individuals who once sacrificed everything for their families. If you're listening to my story today, I hope you remember this. Growing older does not make your voice less valuable. Your kindness should not make you easy to manipulate. And protecting your peace is not selfish. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is finally say, no more. I also learned forgiveness is complicated. Forgiving someone does not mean pretending they never hurt you. It means allowing healing to move forward without letting bitterness destroy what remains of your heart. Ethan and I may never fully erase the pain between us. Some scars stay forever, but people can change when they finally face the truth about themselves honestly. And sometimes broken families can still rebuild something new, not perfect, but real. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted deeply? Or have you ever had to rebuild a relationship after heartbreak? Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Reading your messages reminds us all that none of us are as alone as we sometimes feel.